So Sarah, what could you tell us about Age of Frankenstein?
So Age of Frankenstein is a project that I've had for 3 years with my colleague, Dr. Emily Alder, and it's been looking at the afterlives of Mary Shelley's 1818 novel, and we started the project almost by accident in sort of towards the end of 2015. We were alerted to the fact that in 2016 it was going to be the anniversary of the gathering at the Villa Diodati, which is the sort of place where the legend around the creation of Frankenstein and how Mary Shelley sort of came to write the novel, that's the place that that legend originates from. So it's basically, it's her, and she's a teenager, remember, at this time. So it's her, Shelley, because she's not Mary Shelley yet at this point. So she and Shelley are having an affair. He's actually still married to somebody else. And Byron's doctor, John Polidori. And they are all, and also Claire Claremont, who is Mary's, they're cousins in some ways, and she really wants to have sex with Byron, and that's why she's there. So basically, you have this literary gathering, and this is also a really weird summer because there's lots of volcanic activity, and so it's the year without a summer. So they're on Lake Geneva, they've rented this villa, and it's so scandalous that the hotel across the lake is charging admission for people to look through a telescope to try and find out what these people are up to, mainly what Byron is up to. And the weather's so terrible that they can't sort of enjoy being outside so much, so they decide to tell ghost stories. And so they have this competition about who's going to sort of tell create a ghost story, and so they all have a go at it. And the story that ends up coming out of this for Mary is the story that eventually becomes Frankenstein. So we started the project in 2016, and then we did events all through 2016 and 2017, and then up until the end of 2018, which is the publication bicentenary of the first edition of Frankenstein. And that was sort of where the project ended, basically.
What is it about Frankenstein that you think appeals to both creatives and the general audience?
It's really funny because when we started this project, it ended up being really great because you never really had to explain what Frankenstein was to anyone, because everyone has this conception of what Frankenstein is. And a lot of that does come from the cinema. It does come from the James Whale film. It does come from Boris Karloff's performance, because that's become so iconic. So even if people haven't read the novel, or even if they haven't really even seen the James Whale film or any of the other films that evoke Frankenstein or adapt Frankenstein, they always have some idea of what the story is about and this idea of what the creature looks like. And I think people really like this story because it's a story with so many points of access. It's a story that's been really, really popular with scholars trying out different ways of reading literature, but it's also very, very frequently adapted. It's not as frequently adapted as Dracula. It's not as popular as vampires, because vampires are more sexy, and the creature historically has not necessarily lent itself to that kind of imagery. But people have tried. People have tried. Oh yeah, if you want to see some messed up stuff, just look at. There's a Paul Morrissey, Andy Warhol film called Flesh for Frankenstein, and that's a whole other scene. And but yeah, it is really, really widely adapted because people are really interested in this idea of this figure who is born into the world, essentially sort of physically mature in terms of being sort of fully adult physically, but then trying to sort of understand the world with a consciousness that has really no basis for comparison, and who's immediately sort of traumatized and rejected by their creator. I think they're really fascinated by the idea. I always like to say, when I used to teach Frankenstein to the first years, I always used to say that this is a story about dangerous knowledge and forbidden knowledge, and I think people are really attracted to that, and that's why so many people want to sort of interact with the story of Frankenstein and want to retell it in various ways.
You mentioned James Whale and Boris Karloff film.
Yeah.
Which other Frankenstein films, especially, do you think folks should be looking out for or seek out?
Yeah. Well, I mentioned the Paul Morrissey, Andy Warhol Flesh for Frankenstein, which, as I say, is an acquired taste. Definitely more for people who are into sort of like weird cult and sort of sexploitation stuff. That, you know, that is your first port of call for like weird sort of Frankenstein stuff. But another film which I really, really love and ended up being really foundational in terms of when I first was offered the opportunity to teach Frankenstein, which was very shortly after I joined Napier more than a decade ago. And I was having a conversation with a colleague, and she'd been teaching Frankenstein for a number of years. And she'd been showing the Kenneth Branagh Frankenstein film. And she's like, but it's so terrible. You know, what can we, you know, is there anything else that you think we could show instead of this? And so I ended up reading this article which talked about this film, Eyes Without a Face, Les Yeux Sans Visage, by a French director called Georges Franju. And it's this, Georges Franju is actually a really interesting figure. He's not really sort of seen as like a horror director or anything like that. He's more part of like the French avant-garde, sort of a late surrealist. And he was really important in founding the Cinémathèque Française, which is sort of the equivalent to the British Film Institute here in the UK. And anyway, so this film, Eyes Without a Face, is a really incredible kind of way of thinking about echoes of the Frankenstein story, because it's about a surgeon whose daughter has been disfigured in an accident, and he is completely obsessed with restoring her beauty. And she's this mysterious, almost silent figure who wears a mask the whole time, and she's been hidden away, you know, in their sort of elaborate villa outside of Paris. But there are so many parallels with the way that the surgeon behaves is very similar to Victor Frankenstein in terms of his, like, you know, his obsession with trying to create a beautiful creature, and also his willingness to transgress and to essentially commit crimes to further his own research. There are a lot of interesting parallels there, and that is one of the films that I think is the most interesting to talk about in terms of the legacies of Frankenstein and how the Frankenstein story circulates more widely in culture. That's one I particularly love. I also really love the television series Penny Dreadful and the way that took up versions of the Frankenstein story. I thought that was really fascinating. So that's one I always send people to that's a little bit more conventional in terms of its clear connections to Frankenstein, if that's what people are looking for. And the other things, the other way I like to think about Frankenstein in terms of films people might want to seek out is the way that it's taken up in science fiction. So there's a Black Mirror episode called Be Right Back, which is very, very sort of shades of Frankenstein that I've written about elsewhere, and also films like Alex Garland's Ex Machina as well is certainly one that often comes up in terms of, you know, films that are clearly sort of echoes, you know, not deliberate adaptations of Frankenstein, but that sort of echo it in really fascinating ways.
So do you think things that are straight up adaptations from Frankenstein should stick closely to the source material, or does it just matter about the quality?
Oh, I'm a really big advocate for, you know, so like, you know, so the novel or the source text, like that's over here, that's its own thing. I mean, also consider the fact that particularly just in the last year or so, there have been tons and tons of not just adaptations of Frankenstein, but like textual sort of adaptations. So people who have written like new versions of Frankenstein, or novels which are sort of intersecting with the legacy of Frankenstein. Like there's a book that's been there's a novel that's been translated called Frankenstein in Baghdad, for example, which is sort of a new retelling of Frankenstein in sort of like post-war Iraq, for example. So and there's another. Oh God, I think it's Jeanette Winterson has just written a new book that's about to come out, which is a retelling of Frankenstein as well. So Frankenstein doesn't just get sort of adapted to the screen, it gets adapted in loads of other ways as well. But I'm always about thinking about, well, you know, it's like, okay, so the source text is over here, but I don't think fidelity to that text is an interesting way to approach the story. So I'm always much more interested in, you know, how have you changed the story? How have you made it your own? How have you made it relevant to the time in which you are making your particular project? That's always what interests me more. And that's also what a lot of my research has sort of centered on, is thinking about how does the story change? How does it mutate? You know, how does it become, there's a phrase in Frankenstein which talks about something like unquiet thoughts, and to me Frankenstein's a really unquiet story, so I'm not really interested in people who want to make a really straight up adaptation. That doesn't really interest me, and I think it's a really futile way to sort of approach looking at Frankenstein as well. So I am actually working on, this is my book project that I'm working on. So it's a book which is about silence as a technique in the work of 4 women directors. So it's Lynn Ramsay and Joanna Hogg, who are the British directors, an English director and a Scottish director. And then the French directors are Céline Sciamma and Lucille Hatzlovic. So Céline Sciamma has made a few films, a lot of which have centered on sort of childhood and girlhood. There's one of her films is actually called Girlhood. The French title is Bonnes et Filles, and it's about this protagonist who grows up in like the suburbs, like the banlieue of Paris, and she sort of, you know, finds her way out of that space through, and like sort of finds more agency through actually joining a gang, and then, but she also has that protagonist has a really interesting journey in terms of gender expression as well, and ends up in a very sort of non-binary place at the end, and that's something which has sort of which Sciamma's explored in some of her other film work as well. But her work is not hugely well known here. And then Lucille Hatzlovic has only directed 2 films, and they're both really, really strange, really, really weird, and also focus on child protagonists as well. And they're all, anyway, and silence is one of the things, silence and quiet is one of the things that I'm interested in exploring across their body of work, and how they portray protagonists who are particularly silenced, and what is that silence for? What does that do to the sort of texture of the film? What is that experience like for viewers? Because I don't think that silence always has the same purpose in cinema. So yeah, that's sort of what the project is exploring. And it's a really weird time to be writing that kind of book, because we are navigating a media landscape which is all about breaking silence. So that was not lost on me when I'd been thinking about the project for quite a long time, and then when I finally got a contract for the book last year, I'd almost given up the idea of doing the book now, because I was like, I think it's really the wrong time to do this project, and is anyone really going to go for it? And then I did get a contract for it, so I thought, oh, okay, well, maybe it is going to be, academic publishing moves so slowly anyway. Like by the time it finally comes out, we'll probably be doing something totally different. But it does feel like a strange time to be writing a book about silence and women.
You mentioned Lynn Ramsay. I saw a good. It was in a review of you. We'll never really hear it. Said something like the body count far outweighs the word count. I think that just sums it up perfectly.
Yeah, definitely. And yeah, one of the reasons I love her films so much is because of the way it uses silence. It's because of the way they use silence. And yeah, You Were Never Really Here, I think, is such a fascinating film. Also mainly because it is focusing on a male protagonist, which she hasn't done for a little while. Like a lot of her, the films sort of leading up to that was like, obviously with like Morven Caller and stuff like that, have really focused, and that film in particular really, really focuses on, that extremely taciturn protagonist and how she sort of navigates the world. And so it's really interesting to see her make this film about, which is sort of more about masculine silence, which also has an interesting legacy in the cinema, but I think it's a different one. But You Were Never Really Here is probably going to be in the book as well, but probably as more of a contrast to some of her other work that I'll be looking at in more detail. Like we need to talk about Kevin and Morven Caller.
Silence is obviously used in horror for obvious reasons, but what do you think it can achieve in other genres such as drama?
I mean, silence, yes, you're absolutely right, and silence in horror does have a particular link, particularly to suspense and to suspense, to fear, and I think also to sort of anguish and agony as well, because I think there are only so many sort of screams and like there's only so much Foley that you can, I think, put into a horror film before people become saturated, and so silence can be quite powerful in horror. But I mean, for me, silence is really fascinating in a lot of these films. Like if you think about something like Morven Caller in particular. So when Morven Caller came out, it was a film which was, I think one of the ways in which it was marketed to younger audiences was through the soundtrack, which is a Warp Records soundtrack, and it's got quite a lot of sort of like slightly unusual like electronic music and sort of like stuff that's sort of hard to place, like it's got music from Can and everything in it. And so people think of it as a film which is potentially about music and about and also sort of faintly about sort of late 90s rave culture, but only in the most tangential possible way. And I really see that as a lot of the time that the music is there as a soundtrack that Morven, the protagonist, has designed to sort of like fill in her life, and that this is a character who's actually very comfortable with her own silence, doesn't feel the need to fill in silence with speech all of the time, and the music is sort of there in some ways to sort of speak for her, but also to make the audience feel more comfortable, rather than having these sort of long, elaborate stretches of either quiet, because of course in film you can't have complete silence. The blotting out of the soundtrack is something that audiences particularly, also tend to interpret as a fault, like there's been a technical fault. So if you do that for too long, it's very unsettling, for audiences. And so it's rare that you actually find total silence in cinema. But even when you have prolonged stretches of quiet, that can be quite unsettling, even in scenarios where it's not a horror film. There's not clearly a structure of suspense, but people tend to get quite uncomfortable with that. So so silence is sometimes about, I think, giving your audience an opportunity to think about how they want to interact with the film, thinking about how they want to interact with the character, thinking about interpreting that character and what this means for that character's interiority. Because if the character isn't, sort of doing that expository thing, like telling you what they're thinking or having a dialogue with someone else where that becomes apparent, then you're potentially putting your audience into a different kind of mindset, which I think can be really fascinating.
Going back to vaguely, going back to Lynn Ramsay, the Oscars this year got a whole load of flack for not nominating a single woman director, knowing like Deborah Granick and Lynn Ramsay, for example. But what do you think can be done to rectify that?
Well, personally, I think we have to overthrow the patriarchy and burn it to the ground, and that's the only solution. I don't know, because certainly after the sort of Oscars so white controversy, one of the things that the Academy did was that they appointed a load of new members, and some of those members were women directors like Julie Dash. Anna Liliana Rapport, who made Girl Walks Home Alone at Night. And I was like, oh, this is an interesting move. But I sometimes think what that does is it does bring potentially more marginalized directors into the embrace of the mainstream.
Right, yeah.
But it doesn't fundamentally change what is then being selected. So the only solution is to, I think, commission more work by people from diverse backgrounds, and to actually give that work a platform. And I mean, obviously we all, we do kind of, there is a sense of like looking to the Oscars and like looking to Hollywood to show us how far we've come in a way, but Hollywood in fact is a terrible mirror of that. It really is, because Hollywood always wants to pay lip service to seeming right on. And then there'll always be a sort of like swing back to something more conventional. So it's like, oh yes, everyone got really excited when, Greta Gerwig got nominated for Lady Bird, and, we also had, Call Me By Your Name, got this, everyone saw that movie. And that was, and that was kind of great. But then it's like, oh, and then the next year, no women are nominated for Best Director. And it's still, the figures on that particular statistic are absolutely appalling. Yeah. It really is quite shocking. And I don't know, there's always a sense that, there's also a sense that we're never going to, I don't know if we're going to see radical change somewhere like the Oscars. It's not like things are going to sort of be overturned suddenly, and we'll have this amazing slate of like a year where it's only women nominated for Best Director. Can you even imagine what sort of world would we be living in if that happened? But I sort of feel like that's not going to happen in Hollywood, and looking to Hollywood for that is not really the place for it. One thing I do think is quite exciting is I think you are starting maybe to see a little bit, although I think this too is probably, I did just see something this morning that sort of suggests this might not totally be the case. But I do think with the proliferation of like sort of streaming platforms and the entry into the market of platforms like Mubi and Netflix, there is a sense that there are these other platforms that are potentially reaching very wide audiences that are now acting as commissioning bodies for work, and that might mean that more diverse work is getting a wide platform, as wide a platform as it might once have achieved through, distribution by a huge Hollywood studio, for example. But it's, I think sometimes, particularly because things like, Netflix doesn't release its viewing figures and things like that. Yeah. So there's a sense that some of this is like, some of this information is hard to gauge in a really sort of concrete and statistical way. But certainly there have been projects, and there are sort of ongoing projects like Women in Hollywood, and there's also been a UK project called Calling the Shots. And those are projects which specifically focus on the representation of women in the film industry in the UK and in Hollywood, both in terms of Calling the Shots focus mainly on women's roles within the industry, not representation on screen, but like, you know, all roles, you know, in terms of like directors, costume designers, all of those, you know, sort of kinds of roles. Whereas Women in Hollywood, I think, looks mainly at representation on screen, but they also look at things like women in major roles in the industry, like producers and directors. So there are projects that focus on highlighting that, those kinds of inequalities continually, and that, I think, presumably does have an impact, but those impacts are never as great, or they're never as sudden and never as dramatic as we would like them to be.
You've also done a lot of work on international cinema as well. What do you think, or do you think that it can convey a different message from from English language stuff, or is it just because you like the films, really?
Well, I mean, this whole sort of designation of like, you know, we call anything other than, you know, films that originate. It's interesting that you said English language cinema as well, because that obviously potentially covers quite a wide range of work. Because English language cinema includes, for example, Nollywood, the Nigerian film industry, which is the third largest in the world. Right. And that also includes cinema from places like Canada, where I'm from, which has a different relationship to Hollywood. You know, it includes obviously all, you know, that potentially includes all aspects of American cinema, from Hollywood right down to the smallest indie. And it's really, you know, that within itself is, you know, not an entirely narrow spectrum of work. So this question of like, what do we think about, you know, what do we think about international cinema? And I always ask this when I teach on a course called post-colonial fiction and film. And I always sort of ask this question about, you know, what is this category of world cinema, and what does it really mean? And doesn't it just mean, you know, films that are from the place where you're not currently residing? But does that mean that, you know, does that just mean films with subtitles? You know, what does that really mean? And so I always find that category quite troubling in a way, because obviously, you know, different national cinemas have, you know, potentially different agendas. And I mean, even if you think about something like, you know, like people tend to use the term Bollywood to refer to all cinema that comes out of India. And that's completely inaccurate. You know, Bollywood refers to mainstream Hindi language cinema coming out of the subcontinent. But equally, you know, you have the work of Sajid Ray, which is sometimes referred to as parallel cinema. And you also have, you know, industries which are making films in, you know, in other major languages in the subcontinent, which are not part of Bollywood. So this whole sort of question of how do we talk about international cinema is always quite a fraught one. And I would say that, you know, if you look at, say, a Bollywood film like Farah Khan's Om Shanti Om, which is amazing, by the way. It is absolutely incredible. It's somehow like The Ring with like Phantom of the Opera and like time travel. And also Shah Rukh Khan takes his shirt off for the first time ever. And apparently the reaction to that was not to be believed. And it is a tremendous, tremendous work. But if you look at something like that film, it's really a pretty mainstream picture. There's not necessarily a lot going on there that you would find particularly radical. In the same way that you would look at you know, a mainstream Hollywood film, and you would not expect to find something particularly radical there. That said, there's always lots of there's always lots of really interesting stuff going on. I think in the more marginalized corners of nations. So even when you think about when people think about Canadian cinema, that in itself is quite a fraught question because you have 2 official languages. So and there's actually historically there's been quite a lot of money put into the francophone film industry, and there've been quite a lot of sort of auteurist directors who come out of the province of Quebec, and they tend to be quite critically well regarded as well. So even within somewhere like Canada, there's this sense of, okay, well, we've got, the sort of like francophone cinema, some of which makes it outside of Quebec, some of which never really leaves Quebec, or goes to sort of, might go to sort of other francophone communities in other places in Canada. You have English language cinema within Canada, but even that is kind of a strange thing because lots of people just go and see Hollywood films and might never go and see, sort of more independent Canadian film. And then you have the incredible rise of Indigenous media, where people are making film, people are making films, people are making all kinds of material in a whole variety of Indigenous languages. And that's something that's really exploded in the last sort of decade or so. I mean, there's been there's been a television station devoted to Indigenous programming for quite a long time, but in terms of like the variety of programming that is now potentially available and that's sort of being, stuff that's just being made available, like short films on YouTube and everything, and the advent of things like, like web series and podcasts and everything has really sort of been incredible in terms of creating more and more work that, and then of course, then that the whole designation of what constitutes, sort of like Canadian media, because, obviously that, the designation of Canada and Canadian as a nation and the idea that Canada is on stolen land is also something that's really, really come to the fore in the last few years as well. So even that designation doesn't encompass everything that might come out of a place that we think of as being a predominantly English-speaking nation. That's probably a longer answer than you wanted.
No, it's absolutely perfect. No, I think that's wrap up. Thanks very much for speaking to me, and thanks for watching. Thank you.